Dawn broke on the warm summer morning of July 30th, 1864, as the people of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania began to arise from their slumbers and begin their day. It was going to be a hot one, a day described weather-wise as very warm, even for the midsummer. As the sun began to peek over the south mountains of the Cumberland Valley and lay its warm rays on the town of Chambersburg, to the west of the town sat upwards of 2,800 Confederate cavalrymen, commanded by Brigadier General John McCausland. Holding a council of war in a house along the turnpike, sitting upon a hill overlooking the town, McCausland agreed to follow his orders. After cannon fire officially announced the arrival of the Confederate forces, McCausland and his men descended onto the town from their perch and announced to the citizenry their intentions. By noon, Chambersburg was nothing but a giant inferno, as the warm, calm, clear summer day was clouded by a giant pillar of dark smoke that surrounded and ascended into the sky. In one day's time, the Pennsylvania town of Chambersburg went from a growing center of commerce of the Cumberland Valley to burn-out ruins brought about by the fires of Confederate revenge. Join me as I explore the burning of Chambersburg. 1864 was the third year of the American Civil War, and the war was changing. With the loss of General Stonewall Jackson in 1863, who was General Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, Lee's military successes of the beginning of the war began to become defeats. Lee's second attempt to bring the war to the North failed catastrophically during his defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. In 1864, Sherman was pushing south towards Atlanta. General Grant was keeping constant pressure on Lee's Army of Northern Virginia as he pushed towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. And Union forces were pushing into the Shenandoah Valley, which was a fertile farming area that provided much needed food to the Southern armies. All were resulting in abnormally high casualties. No matter how you looked at it, the war was becoming more brutal and bloody by the day, and these new tactics were working for the North. After a Union force assaulting the Shenandoah Valley was routed at the Battle of New Market, its commanding officer was removed and was replaced by General Grant with General David Hunter. Now, Hunter was a staunch abolitionist and radically hated the Southern cause. He took General Ulysses S. Grant's hardball approaches to war to a whole new level as Hunter descended into the Shenandoah Valley. Hunter's army of 8,500 infantry and cavalry destroyed stores, warehouses, and miles of railroad as it swept south through the Shenandoah Valley along what is today the I-81 corridor in Virginia. As this Union force passed through Staunton, Virginia and on to Lexington, Hunter's men looted and stole from the locals as they went. In Lexington, Hunter burned the Virginia Military Institute, torched the home of Virginia Governor John Letcher, looted Washington University, and burned other private dwellings. In response to this unheard of pyrotechnic actions of the Southern hater called General Hunter, Lee chose the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, previously commanded by Stonewall Jackson. but now commanded by General Jubal Early, to face Hunter and drive him from the Shenandoah. This was a good choice because Early was much of as a Yankee hater as Hunter was a rebel hater. Early was in fact the man who took delight in ordering the burning of Thaddeus Stevens's ironworks, which was located here in what is now Caledonia State Park. Because Stevens was an enemy of the South for being a very vocal abolitionist in Congress, for he was a congressman. Now, Early easily defeated Hunter and drove him into West Virginia in the middle of June of 1864. General Early moved north, up the Shenandoah Valley and into the Harper's Ferry area. On July 6th, Early's cavalry commander, General John McCausland, crossed the Potomac and held Hagerstown, Maryland, which is where I'm at today. I'm actually in Hagerstown Park. And they held it for ransom for $20,000 under threat of being burned to the ground if they didn't pay the $20,000. Now, Early's original orders of ransoming the town was for $200,000, which was misread by McCausland, and he left out a digit. So this made it easy for the town of Hagerstown to pay. So, of course, it was spared from being set aflame. Now, on July 8th, Frederick, Maryland was also held for ransom, but for the total of $200,000, which was paid and used for relief efforts of the victims in Staunton and Lexington that were assaulted by General Hunter. Early then moved on Washington, the capital of the North and home to President Abraham Lincoln, who was campaigning for his second term, which was to be voted on that November. Now, on July 11th, Early reached Washington's defenses, but his all-out assault that he planned was hindered by arrival of veteran Union troops, so he decided to withdraw back to Virginia. Now, Early's comments on this was, "We haven't taken Washington, but we've scared Abe Lincoln like hell." Meanwhile, Hunter was back at it as he burned private homes in Jefferson County, West Virginia, homes that had no tangible connection to the war. Hunter overstepped his instructions by Grant, who said to make all the valley south of the Baltimore and Ohio Road a desert as high up as possible. I do not mean that houses should be burned, but every particle of provisions and stock should be removed, and the people notified to move out. The last part of Grant's instructions is what Early quoted the most for his next decision. Grant said that the job should be so thorough that crows flying over it for the balance of the season will have to carry their provender with them. General Early decided it was time to open the eyes of the people of the North to this enormity by an example in the way of retaliation. Early selected the hub of the Cumberland Valley Railroad as his target, the only town of importance within reach of his forces north of the Mason-Dixon line. That town would provide $100,000 in gold, or $500,000 in U.S. currency as compensation for General Hunter's destruction of private property in Jefferson County, or the town would be set to the torch. Early's target was Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Chambersburg was no stranger to the war. It was raided in 1862 by Jeb Stuart's Confederate Cavalry, where the Cumberland Valley Railroad, which was a main rail line providing troop and supply movements to Union forces in the South, was a main target. Again, in 1863, it was occupied by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, as Lee moved west on what is now Route 30 to his famous defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg. And Lee actually stood here in the square at one point, determining which way he was going to take his army. Chambersburg was the county seat for Franklin County, Pennsylvania, where the courthouse is now casting its shadow upon me right now. Chambersburg was a bustling hub of commerce and merchants thanks to the Cumberland Valley Railroad that had workshops and warehouses in the rail yard in town. It was a strategic location for the Union Army to maintain because of the supply lines that ran through here. Also centered in Chambersburg was the Department of the Susquehanna, which was a Union military department under the command of General Darius N. Couch, that was supposed to organize emergency militia forces raised by Pennsylvania to help repel rebel raids. This department, along with other departments of their kind, were disorganized, lacked resources, and was basically ineffective. At the end of July of 1864, the majority of Couch's men were diverted south to help defend Maryland and Washington, D.C., leaving Pennsylvania and Chambersburg vulnerable. To defend Chambersburg in the Cumberland Valley, Couch had fewer than 400 men, including a small amount of Maryland infantry, 2 companies of mounted militia located in Greencastle and along the state line, 2 artillery pieces, and 45 men from the 6th U.S. Cavalry under the command of Lieutenant Hancock T. McLean. That was it. Meanwhile, General Early dispatched a courier on the evening of July 28, 1864, to the cavalry camp of General John McCausland. McCausland was ordered to command his own brigade of Virginia cavalry, 4 artillery pieces, and General Bradley Johnson's Maryland Brigade, and take this force here to Chambersburg to ransom the town. The Confederate force numbered approximately 2,800 men, and on the evening of July 28th, assembled in Berkeley County, West Virginia, ready to cross the Potomac. McCausland sent Major Harry Gilmore and 2 Confederate Maryland cavalry units to McCoy's Ferry to secure the area for the main force to cross the Potomac. Gilmore's men reached this position right here, McCoy's Ferry, at 6 a.m. at daybreak on July 29th, and quickly dislodged the Union pickets that guarded the river crossing here. The Southern fighting Marylanders also gained control of the C&O Canal, which is located on their home state shores, right on the other side of the camera here where I'm standing. Gilmore then sent men out to patrol the National Road, which is modern-day Route 40, which is further inland over on that side there. And upon running into a Union cavalry unit in Clear Spring, Maryland, the Confederates lost 3 men in a skirmish. McCausland's plan was for Gilmore to push the Federal troops towards Hagerstown on the National Road and make it seem like the Confederate forces were driving towards Hagerstown, Maryland. To complete this ruse, Early was advancing his troops towards Hagerstown, Shepherdstown, and Harper's Ferry, which confused the Union commanders. This was all to keep the Union busy, while McCausland's main force was at its most vulnerable, while it was crossing the Potomac River into Maryland, here at McCoy's Ferry. By 11 a.m., July 29, 1864, McCausland's army was occupying the little town of Clear Spring, Maryland, which is where I'm at right now. Actually, I'm right next to the War Memorial here at Clear Spring. Upon arrival, Confederate soldiers looted local businesses. Some eyewitnesses claimed that people lost upwards of $3,000 to the raiders. Meanwhile, Gilmore was facing stiff resistance upon the National Road. At one point, his forces were ambushed by Yankee cavalrymen taking cover behind stone walls and trees along the road. The Yankees laid heavy fire on both sides of the road, resulting in 17 casualties to the Confederate unit. Gilmore's force routed the Yankees and continued to push forward, eventually crossing the Conocajig Creek via the Stone Arch Bridge that sits behind me here at Wilson, and traveling to Cunningham's Crossroads, which is now known as Searfoss today. McCausland's main force pushed forward into Pennsylvania via Blair's Valley, a valley that provided mountain cover to prevent the main force from being seen very easily. And that's where I'm at now, is Blair's Valley. If anybody is followers of my channel from previous videos, you would recognize this place as the place for mile marker 114. This is the Mason-Dixon line, and this is where McCausland would have crossed into Pennsylvania from Maryland. Now, ahead of McCausland's main force was a small Union force that was led by Lieutenant Hancock McLean. McLean's force was smaller than 30 men, and they retreated to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, leaving a few soldiers about a mile south of town lay in ambush for the advancing Confederates. That would have been north of where I'm standing at right now. Now, when the head of McCausland's 2,800 Confederate force reached the soldiers, they opened fire, fell back, opened fire again, and repeated this tactic for an hour to make a few men seem like 100. Now, this harassment of McCausland's men slowed his progress into Pennsylvania. The head of McCausland's force pushed McLean to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where a shootout occurred in the town square, which is where I'm standing at right now. The snow happens to be real busy. But McLean was forced to relinquish the town to McCausland at about 3 p.m. and retreated further back into Pennsylvania. By 5 p.m., McCausland's Confederates poured into Chambersburg here, and by 8 p.m., McCausland's main force was occupying this town. The soldiers laid resting in the streets, eating and smoking. Some looted the stores here. The majority of the force, however, made camp and rested north of the town, out that way, and in the area which is now a Rutter's gas station. Now, Gilmore and his men, they turned towards Chambersburg, following what is now Route 416, north through the little town of Welsh Run, Pennsylvania, and they regrouped here with McCausland in Chambersburg at 10 p.m. To Gilmore and his men's disappointment, McCausland was ready to move out about the time that they arrived, giving Gilmore's men no rest. By midnight, the majority of the Confederates were leaving Chambersburg behind them and heading up what is now 416. McCausland's plan was to travel up modern-day Route 416 and travel through the little town of Bridgeport, which is now today known as Marks, Pennsylvania. In previous videos, I have been to this little village before, discussing Fort McDowell that occupied this area 110 years before the Civil War. And right here is actually the monument behind me here for Fort McDowell. But back then, during the Fort McDowell days, the Indians were the raiders. Now it was the Southerners. McLean, with his small 30-man force, harassed the head of McCausland's column here at Marks, Pennsylvania. But being outnumbered, they continued to be pushed back further east towards Chambersburg. All along the road to Chambersburg, McLean slowed McCausland's advance. At 2 a.m., McLean was pushed out of St. Thomas, which is where I'm standing at right now, along the Loudon Pike that is now known as Route 30. And as you can see, it's a very busy route today, or it's also known as the Lincoln Highway. Now, McCausland continued east along the turnpike towards his target. Meanwhile, in Chambersburg, just east of here, General Couch and the Department of the Susquehanna was arranging for as many quartermaster supplies as possible to be moved by rail out of Chambersburg and to safety of someplace else. Local merchants moved livestock and goods via wagon north to Shippensburg for safekeepings. Now, the Cumberland Valley Railroad shut down all traffic south of Chambersburg to Greencastle, Pennsylvania. As the Confederate raiders rode east on the Loudon Pike, which is modern-day Route 30, which is right behind me here, many were asleep in their saddles because they haven't slept in 24 hours. The strung-out force eventually got a wake-up call when the head of the column ran into McLean's men, reinforced by soldiers from Chambersburg, who now had a cannon pointing at the raiders. With a blast from the cannon, one Confederate was killed and several were wounded. To hold back the rebel raiders, McLean shot 5 more canisters at McCausland's force. McCausland, however, realized that McLean's force was far outnumbered, so he ordered his men to flank the Yankees and drive them off the hill that they occupied just a few miles west of Chambersburg. McLean's tactics allowed for the headquarters of the Department of the Susquehanna to leave Chambersburg with General Couch, so realizing his trip was no longer working, McLean took his force north to Shippensburg for safety. During McLean's valiant stand against such a large Confederate force, a Cumberland Valley Railroad employee named Thomas Bard was pumping a hand car south on the cleared railroad line from Chambersburg to here, Greencastle. After completing the journey, Bard sought out Union Brigadier General William W. Averell, who was camped somewhere around Greencastle here. Now, Averell commanded 2,500 cavalrymen who would be able to put up a fight against McCausland. The problem was, nobody knew where he was at. Searching through the night, Bard finally found Averell and his troops camped at the Fleming Farm just north of Greencastle, which the Fleming Farm is right here at Corporal Real Monument along 11 here. Averell was asleep in Fleming's front yard, which is right back here, if you can see past that gate right there. And he was recovering from fighting General Early's Confederates in the streets of Hagerstown the day before. Now, Averell went into the Fleming house to consult a local map and determined that the Confederates would most likely ride through Chambersburg and escape down the Gettysburg Turnpike, which is current Route 30, east of Chambersburg. And he figured he'd do this because, just like Jeb Stuart did 2 years previously, he would go that direction. Now, Averell planned to intercept them east of Chambersburg in the morning and rode east to New Franklin from here and on to Greenwood, which is just west of Fayetteville, Pennsylvania, which was the complete opposite direction. Meanwhile, McCausland's men set up camp on a hill just 1 mile west of Chambersburg, while McCausland commandeered Henry Grenewald's house as his headquarters. This house still stands, which is right behind me here, and it stands on top of what is now referred to as Radio Hill, which is where I'm standing right now. It's adjacent to the Sunny Way Foods, which is over here at the end of Warm Spring Road. It was in this house behind me that many of McCausland's men recommended not burning the town as ordered, but General John McCausland had his orders from his commanding officer, which was General Early, and he intended to follow those orders. At 5:30 a.m., cannon fire opened up onto the town of Chambersburg. At around 6 shots were launched over the town from the hill McCausland occupied, which is where I'm standing at right now. Now, Confederates were then sent, and it would be that way, they were sent into the town, down this hill and into the town, to secure it and block the exits to prevent the escape of any of the citizens. Soon, McCausland, Johnson, and Gilmore, along with other officers, arrived here at the Franklin Hotel, which is located where the Presbyterian Church sits today, which is right behind me here, and it sits on the square. The officers took breakfast at the hotel as Confederates spread out among the streets, many robbing the townspeople and breaking into shops. Confederate soldiers broke into stores and walked away with candy, spices, hats, coats, bonnets, and feathers. The people on the streets were robbed of hats, watches, and even boots. If someone looked well dressed, a pistol was stuck to their head and money was extracted. Homes were looted as well, where drawers were rifled through and silverware and liquor was stolen. The liquor caused a whole new problem as it was being used heavily by some of the on-duty soldiers, which was prohibited in the Southern Army. Soon, the streets of Chambersburg were filled with robbers, thieves, and drunkards as the discipline disintegrated among the Confederate ranks. After breakfast at the Franklin Hotel, McCausland ordered Gilmore to round up 50 of the prominent men of the town, as a local attorney named J.W. Douglas was instructed to inform townspeople of the ransom demand of $100,000 in gold or $500,000 in U.S. currency, or the town would be torched. Douglas was instructed to round up money. Douglas discovered as he roamed the streets of Chambersburg that most of Chambersburg citizens didn't take the threat seriously. After being raided twice before, The citizens experienced more private property damage by Union militia occupying the town than they ever experienced by the Confederates. Jeb Stuart in 1862 and Robert E. Lee in 1863 targeted public stores such as the Cumberland Valley Railroad and never targeted private property. The citizens expected history to repeat itself. What they didn't realize was how much the war had changed in the past year. Brutality and bloody tactics had reached their doorsteps this time. Douglas returned to McCausland with no money to contribute to the ransom, and with even worse news. The banks had been emptied, anticipating a coming Confederate raid. With this news, McCausland ordered the courthouse bell to be rung in order to round up the citizens in the town square. With Gilmore's efforts to round up prominent citizens and others meeting in the square, McCausland had his orders read aloud right here in front of the courthouse, demanding the ransom or Chambersburg would be set to the torch. Still no money was raised, and McCausland was again informed that no money existed to be given. Some time passed here on the square of Chambersburg, and no money was presented. So around 9 a.m., July 30th, 1864, General John McCausland gave the order to burn Chambersburg, sparing only the churches. Immediately after the order was given, rebels entered the paint store across the street from this location, which the paint store had been right behind me here. They rolled 2 barrels of turpentine across the street here, and they rolled it right over here into the courthouse. They broke the barrel heads open, and then they struck a match. Within a few minutes, this great building was engulfed in flames. Squads of soldiers moved about the town, first breaking into businesses in the main part of town, stealing what they could. The predominant way of burning the buildings was breaking up furniture, piling the pieces in the center, applying oil, and lighting the fire. They would go every other building with the idea that the building in between would eventually light itself. Now, General McCausland himself entered Nixon's drugstore, which sat in this area around here at this thrift store that I'm standing at the moment. And he entered here to make sure there was nothing present that could inhibit the flames, and then the store was set aflame, resulting in a loss of $7,000 of goods to Mr. J.S. Nixon. Now, as the looting and burning continued, men, women, and children were sent out of their homes with usually nothing but the clothes on their backs. Mr. Wolfkill was an old and feeble man who was sick and bedridden in his home, which sat here somewhere in this parking lot. Now, the rebels set his house on fire with him still in it. Chambersburg citizens arrived to remove Mr. Wolfkill from his fiery fate. Mrs. Cuss, the wife of the jeweler, whose shop sat here, about where this the bridal shop is today in Chambersburg, on Main Street, was lying dead in her home. Despite the presence of the dead body, the rebels applied a torch to the house anyway. Mrs. Cuss was removed and buried quickly in the garden as the flames grew larger around the small plot of land. She was reinterred in the Catholic cemetery the next day with her baby that was dying during the attack and was cared for by Mrs. Shyrock. Mr. S.M. Royston, who was the barkeeper at Montgomery's Hotel, which sat here at the corner of the courthouse annex and this parking lot here near the King Street Church and the Coil-Free Library here in town. But Mr. Royston was robbed of $700, which was his life savings, as he descended the stairs to escape the hotel. Mrs. Denning escaped her home by wetting blankets and wrapping herself in them so she could escape through the back door of her home. Now, Father McCullum, which was a Catholic priest, was robbed of his watch by a party of rebels. Father McCullum was also robbed of his watch 1 year earlier when the Confederates were here during the Gettysburg campaign. Bad time to be a Catholic priest in Chambersburg. Not all Confederate soldiers agreed with the orders that they received. Confederate Captain Baxter of Baltimore, Maryland, refused to participate and help many people recover belongings from their burning houses. Surgeon Richardson of the Confederates also publicly denounced the burning and aided a woman's escape out of town with her belongings by giving her his horse. Captain Watts saved all of 2nd Street south of Queen Street by refusing to burn his section that he was assigned, and he and his men aided in fighting the flames with the citizens. An entire company, commanded by an unknown captain, did not act on their orders, saving the southeastern part of town from firing and looting. A fellow Mason among the Southern ranks ordered for the Masons' Lodge to not withstand the flames of Confederate revenge, saving the Masons' Lodge. An artist named Mr. Daniel Ridgway Knight, who painted this rendition of the victims of Chambersburg, was approached by rebel officers to get the women out of town for fear of them being attacked sexually due to the many intoxicated rebel soldiers gallivanting around the town. Now, as more houses were put to the torch, citizens were running wildly in the streets, trying to locate family and children, trying to save valuable articles such as furniture, sewing machines, family pictures. People ran about with clothing, bedding, carpets, and books, trying to find places of safety. Vacant lots and cemeteries became sites of safety as people fled the heat of the fire. It was a calm day. Jacob Hoke, an eyewitness, described the scene as column after column of smoke rose black, straight, and single. First one, then another, and another. Each of these then, like huge serpents, whiffed and twisted into 1,000 fantastic shapes until all finally blended and commingled and formed one vast and livid column of smoke and flame, which rose perpendicularly to the sky and then spread out into a huge crown of sackcloth, which shielded the now homeless citizens of Chambersburg from the extremely hot July sun. Hoke also describes a weather phenomenon caused by the extreme change in air temperature and updrafts. In the town square, which is just 1 block behind me here, you can see the modern day courthouse behind me. But in a town square, a cyclone was formed by the upward winds caused by the surrounding fire, now known as a fire whirl. The funnel-shaped apparition moved east on Market Street, which is where I'm standing right now, which is modern-day Lincoln Highway East, throwing burning shingles and boards into the air. It would have came from the square and up towards where I'm standing at right now. Now, the twister passed over vacant ground and escaped the flames, which citizens were piling their clothing and bedding that they were able to save from their burning homes. The cyclone quickly caught hold of these items and proceeded to throw pillows and feather beds and quilts and other light items into the air. It grabbed hold of a 4-year-old girl and lifted her 6 to 8 feet into the air as well. Now, there were several examples of the citizens fighting back. One elderly woman attacked a soldier with her broom, giving the rebel a sound drubbing. Now, Andrew J. Miller was standing in an adjacent hallway to his drugstore when 2 rebels entered it to loot and burn the building. In their haste, the soldiers accidentally locked themselves inside. Andrew Miller gave them both barrels of his shotgun, and they either died from their wounds or from the flames that soon consumed them. Confederate Captain Colter A. Bailey was the highest-ranking Confederate casualty in Chambersburg that day. A drunken Bailey was captured by citizens, but made a run for it, which resulted in him getting shot. A drunken wounded Bailey hid in a cellar of a burning house until the heat got too much for him. As he came out begging to be spared, members of the crowd shot him dead. He was later buried in the Methodist cemetery. Now, Jacob Hoke says that the citizens gathered in farms and cemeteries around the town, where they in silence and sadness sat and looked upon the destruction of their homes and the accumulations of a lifetime. And to all this, the roaring and crackling of the flames, the sound of falling walls, the distressing cries of burning animals as horses, cattle, and swine, and a picture of the terrible is seen which no one who witnessed it would ever desire to have repeated. Colonel Alexander K. McClure was a staunch Republican. huge supporter of Abraham Lincoln and a huge critic of the Confederacy. He was outspoken on national politics in his newspaper that he published. His house, called Norland, sat a mile north of town on the farm that is now occupied by Wilson College. And behind me would be the location of Norland. Not satisfied with just burning Colonel McClure's printing establishment in town, a squad was detached to travel the distance outside of town, bypassing other prominent homes to personally burn down Norland. Now, Captain Frederick W. Smith, one of McCausland's staff officers and son of Virginia Governor William Smith, commanded this squad and was greeted upon arrival by Mrs. Matilda McClure, Alexander's wife, who was very ill at the time. Now, Smith informed her of his orders to burn her home and gave her and her family 10 minutes to vacate the property. With Colonel McClure not home, the Confederates assisted Mrs. McClure in removing a trunk of clothes, some of her husband's books, and her family, while Captain Smith stole a gold watch and a silver pitcher from her home. Within a few minutes, the beautiful home was in flames, along with a bank barn full of wheat that was nearby. Upon returning to Chambersburg after burning Norland, Captain Smith gave the silver pitcher, which was too hard for him to haul on horseback, to Mrs. Kennedy with the specific instructions to please deliver this to Mrs. Colonel McClure with the compliments of Captain Smith. Colonel McClure's losses was estimated to be over $26,000, equivalent to almost $500,000 in today's money. Now, in 1865, McClure rebuilt Norland to what you see behind me here, and it is now an administration office for Wilson College. As the town burned and the pillar of smoke could be seen from miles around, McCausland's Confederates began to pull out of the town. Now, this occurred between 11 a.m. and noon, which means in less than 3 hours, McCausland was able to torch the town of Chambersburg. Now, McCausland's plan was to return west along the Loudon Road, which is Route 30 west of the town, to escape from what was coming, which was a Union cavalry unit in the form of General Averell and his division, who would be turning west towards Chambersburg along the Gettysburg Pike, which is Route 30 east of town, and heading this direction to eventually take out the rebel raiders. As McCausland's men slipped west, Averell and his men arrived at the Burning of Chambersburg at 2 p.m. To the horror of the Union cavalrymen, they had to press through the town to pursue McCausland's force. C.M. Newcomer of Cole's Maryland Cavalry, fighting for the Union, wrote, "Those of us who were in the advance went through the burning town, bending forward upon our horses' necks as fast as our faithful steeds would carry us. We had no knowledge of the great destruction and devastation that we should witness, and when we had once started, it was necessary to continue through the burning streets. Houses on fire on both sides, it was no time to turn back, and to stop was to be burned up. Our poor horses were mad with fright. Each and every one of us felt relieved when we got to the outer edge of the town. The atmosphere was stifling, with the smoke that settled over the earth like a pall. The citizens were gathered in groups, strong men with bowed heads, women wringing their hands, and the little children clinging to their mothers' dresses and crying. Desolation on all sides. It was a sad picture, long to be remembered." As Averell chased McCausland west across the Loudon Road and into Fulton County, the fires began to burn out in Chambersburg. Luckily, very little loss of life was experienced by the citizenry. Because the burning occurred on a warm summer morning and not during winter or at night or during a storm, the elements did not affect the refugees as bad as what they could have. In fact, only one death was recorded as a result of the burning, and that was of Mr. Daniel Parker, a former slave who settled in Chambersburg after traveling the Underground Railroad. Mr. Parker died that evening due to his age and illnesses, made worse by either smoke or stress, or possibly both. There are no recorded accounts of sexual assaults during the attack, despite fears of possible actions of the drunkards. That evening, over 2,000 people were homeless, and they traveled the countryside looking for shelter by family members, or they crowded into homes that were spared by the fire. By the next day, assessing of the damage began on the town. The official report says that there were 266 residences and places of businesses burned, 98 barns and stables, and 173 outbuildings of various kinds, making the total of buildings burned in the attack 537. Claims adjudicated were over $713,000 for real estate losses and $915,000 for personal property losses, totaling $1.6 million at the time. This would be over $31 million in today's money. Unlike previous attacks to Chambersburg, this time the Cumberland Valley Railroad suffered very little damage, showing that the target was not public works but private homes and businesses. Despite the losses, Chambersburg would rebuild, as you can see behind me. As we see today, Chambersburg returned to a previous glory, rebuilding the courthouse, the bank, and many buildings around and about the streets that once were overrun by Confederate raiders with torches. As a direct result of the burning of Chambersburg, people began to flood north to avoid a possible attack by Confederates. This created a refugee issue. The Susquehanna Department's Signal Corps returned to create signal stations that would allow for spotters to communicate incoming Confederate raiders across the valley to allow for time to evacuate possible areas threatened by attack. On the national scale, however, McCausland's raid forced General Grant to appoint Philip Sheridan as Union commander of the forces in the Cumberland and Shenandoah valleys, which resulted in driving General Early out of the valley for good. The thing that the events of Chambersburg didn't stop was the very thing Early was hoping would stop, and that was the escalating horrors of the war. In fact, the war continued to get more brutal and bloodier, which resulted in Union General William Tecumseh Sherman burning down Atlanta, Georgia. This brutality left its scar on American history. In the 1980s, my father went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to track down my fourth great-grandfather's Civil War service record. While there, he was sitting next to a lady who was at the archives with a similar intent. In conversation, Dad mentioned how hard it was for him to track down family records when his county's courthouse was destroyed by the Confederates when they burnt Chambersburg in 1864. He added that it was a shame for the loss. The mild-mannered lady then responded in a huff as she said, and I quote, "I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and the Union burnt my entire city to the ground, along with many other towns in the South. You sons of bitches deserved it." Dad began to chuckle and immediately apologized for his ignorance. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I appreciate all of you and your support. Please see my references in the description and give this video a like if you would like to see more, and if you want to add anything to the story, please drop a comment. But this story is not yet over. Where does McCausland go? Does he get away? Did Averell catch up to him? Find out in the follow-up video, Revenge of the Union. Stay tuned.